Today, the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, is expected to be preparing to announce his much-anticipated autumn budget, which, of course, is taking place on Thursday. Now, I'm delighted to be joined, first of all, today by Mark Littlewood, the Director General of the Institute for Economic Affairs, in terms of discussing what exactly will be involved in this autumn statement. One might describe it as a budget, certainly a bit more of a maxi budget than the mini budget that we saw, of course, only a few months ago. And Mark, first of all this morning, we're of course being told by the Chancellor that everyone can expect taxes to go up and indeed spending to go down. Just how painful would this be?
Well, Tom, we pretty much, I think, know the numbers now, if the leaks are to be believed, that there's going to be about £35 billion worth of spending cuts. That's not an insignificant amount of money, but it's not a very big part of the government budget. They should be able to find that broadly through efficiency savings. In terms of the tax rises, what we suspect, perhaps the Chancellor will surprise us on Thursday, is that the income tax thresholds will be changed or frozen. So that means as your salary goes up, if you're on a low salary, let's say below 12,000, but you get a £1,000 pay rise, you may now find you're paying income tax. If you're a rather higher earner, you may find that you're dragged into the 40p rate of income tax. And if you're a very high earner, earning well over £100,000 a year, we might well find that the 45p rate of tax, the top rate of tax, kicks in at maybe 125,000 rather than 150,000. So pretty much for all earners, you can expect that more income tax will be coming out of your paycheck after Jeremy Hunt's spoken on Thursday than before. The one thing I will give him a bit of praise for compared to the last government is I think they've correctly analysed that we need to show some fiscal constraint. If there was a criticism of the Truss Kwarteng government, it was that they seemed to think they could spend money on tax cuts and energy bailouts forevermore. The Sunak-Hunt administration realises there has to be some effort to balance the books. But I don't think that anything that's going to change on Thursday, and if I'm right about that speculation, is actually going to do what you've just mentioned in your bulletin, Tom, to put Britain on a sustainable fiscal trajectory. That's the aim. Well, we're going to have to find a lot more cuts to achieve that, I'm afraid. This so-called 40 or 50 billion pound black hole they faced this week is just the start of that. In truth, Britain is trillions of pounds in debt.
Of course, the Liz Truss diagnosis of the problem in terms of why there is this black hole in the first place, in terms of why there isn't enough money to spend on the things that we would like to be spent on or indeed to lower taxes, is because of the problem of growth, that we haven't had as high growth as we would want for the last few decades. And I wonder, does this new government, in your view, have the same diagnosis of the problem? Do they get the issue here? Because, of course, we talk about painful tax rises and spending cuts. Those wouldn't be necessary were the growth rate higher.
Yeah, I think that's right, Tom. I mean, my great disappointment with the Liz Truss administration imploding was I thought that the medical diagnosis was bang on right, if you like. I mean, you might heavily criticise the surgery that followed that diagnosis, but at least they got the diagnosis right, that essentially our economy has been more or less flatlining. I mean, growing at the rate of maybe 1% or so a year since the financial crash. And historically, our growth rates have been nearer 2.5%. Now, that difference between 1% and 2.5%, well, that might not sound like a big difference to your viewers, Tom. But when you compound that over time, when it's 2.5%, every year for a decade or every year for a generation, as opposed to 1% every year for a decade or every year for a generation, the impact that makes on our personal finances and the government's ability to collect revenue to pay for public services is truly enormous. And unfortunately, this government hasn't said anything about Liz Truss's much prized supply side reforms. These are, what ways can we deregulate the economy or free up business? She was going to roll out a whole load of investment zones where tighter regulations wouldn't apply. She, of course, it was a mess in Parliament at the time when the vote took place, wanted to allow fracking for shale gas to help our energy industry. Almost the first action of the new Prime Minister was to make it very clear fracking was going to be banned again. So I haven't really heard much from the new administration, from the Sunak-Hunt administration, about are they going to do anything at all to liberate business. At the moment, it seems to be going back to this slight sort of bean counting, some of which is valuable. You shouldn't be spending a lot more than you're bringing in, but there doesn't seem to be a great deal of imagination. I mean, Liz Truss basically took on the Treasury orthodoxy, and the Treasury orthodoxy won.
It is extraordinary that we are facing a global economic slowdown, a third of the global economy now in recession, mainly due to an energy crisis. And two of the first things this new government does is undo liberalisations in terms of re-banning onshore wind and shale gas extraction, banning two ways that the British economy could generate more electricity. It's the most extraordinary priority list, and I wonder if this is a pretty bad sign of things to come.
Yeah, I'm worried about it, Tom, because I think if you, when we look through the sort of tea leaves and the record of the very short-lived Truss administration, it at least did have a bit of an eye on the long term. They might have tried to do too much in their 44 days in office, but the sort of aim was, let's put in place now things that will improve circumstances, not just tomorrow or next week or next month. Policy takes time to trickle through with its impact, but let's put in place now things that might have an impact in maybe a year's time, 2 years' time, 3 years' time. I mean, clearly, if we were to, liberalise our planning laws to allow much more house building, or as you've just mentioned, Tom, allow fracking for shale gas, we wouldn't expect that to come on stream tomorrow or next week. It's not an immediate fix. It would take some years for us to actually realise the benefits of that in any meaningful way. But I worry now that we've gone back to, if you like, the extreme short term, that all that matters is that on Thursday the money markets respond relatively well to Jeremy Hunt's autumn budget. And that does matter. I'm not diminishing that. But we seem now to have got ourselves to a position in government when sort of all that matters is the next 24 hours. The next 24 hours always matter, but we should have half an eye on the next 24 months. And I don't think there's any real long-term vision or long-term planning for how things might be a bit better for the UK economy in, say, 2024 compared to 2022. So when we do get to 2024, I'm expecting all of these problems to emerge again. And I'll be sitting here talking to you, Tom, in a couple of years' time about, I'm terribly sorry, we're going to have to put taxes up again to fix a fiscal hole. And unless you actually take a longer-term view about economic growth, we're going to be in this vicious spiral of higher taxes, heavy regulation, desperately trying to get spending under control because there's been no plan to actually get our growth rates back to the sort of 2 or 3% that we were used to. So we need, I know it might be a desperate plea, but we need politicians of all stripes to think rather more long-term about the economy in the next 2, 5, 10 years, rather than just how they survive the next 2 days or 2 weeks.
Potentially, this is the story of the last 30 years of British governance, that you've got politicians with increasingly short political lifespans, the speed of government rolling over ever faster, and a lack of any sort of thinking about strategic long-term investment. It's a depressing situation, but let's hope that it will be lighter, perhaps, down the road. Mark, thank you for joining us and that depressing analysis of where we are as a country and an economy.